Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. It's really nice to see you here. Those of you who are in my class, listen very carefully, more carefully than you do even when you're in class. Name, class, including section number. If you're at 8 o'clock, it's A. If you're at 11 o'clock, it's F. Would you remember that, please? And save my poor brain from figuring it out later. You're going to sign it, and that's your attendance for tonight. Got it? And it's my civil donate, so don't lose it. Okay, for those of you all know who I am. I'm Father Bud Grant. I teach here at St. Ambrose. I've been here this is the beginning, this semester is the beginning of my 30th year teaching at St. Ambrose. And with Ethan, Dr. Ethan Ganaway right here. We are the co-directors of the Academy for the Study of St. Ambrose of Milan. We've been around here forever, and we are trying to make Ambrose Ambrosian. And it's working pretty well because we got Father Allan here back for the third time since we started this adventure. Father Allan Fitzgerald is an Augustinian priest. He is now at Villanova. He spent 12 years, is that right, in Rome, teaching St. Ambrose at the Augustinianum in Rome. He studied in Rome, and then he studied in Paris after that for 4 years. And he is a big fan of March Madness. So talk to him about that nonsense. I don't understand it at all. As I told some of you before, the thing about Father Allan is that not only is he a great intellect, he is a great soul. He is the kind of person that you just want to listen to. He doesn't know this story, but many of you have already heard me tell you it. I once went to a conference where he was presenting, and I realized that I could just make it to his talk if I ran across, but there was already people standing outside of the door. This is a conference where usually the seats are half empty. It was filled and out the door, standing room only, and he has this beautiful voice that somehow doesn't put you to sleep. It actually inspires you. Listening to Father Allan is like getting a spiritual massage. So welcome and congratulations for being here because you are in for a real treat. His talk tonight is called Ambrose and His Community. I'm reading it right here. Keeping Faith and Life Together. So please welcome, for the third time on campus, Father Allan Fitzgerald. Yes, it's true.
It is a pleasure to be here. In trying to put some words together that I thought would be appropriate for this occasion. It was kind of a challenge, but recognizing that there was a place back in the Second Vatican Council where it talked about one of the dangers of our time being the split between the faith that people profess and the life that people live. I tried to ask that question of Ambrose, to see if in his efforts to hold life and faith together, he might have something that would be useful for us to hold on to and to give us some inspiration. So it is my pleasure to be with you. I don't have the talk memorized. Would not be good at trying to put this one out extemporaneously, so I'm going to be doing a bit of reading, but bear with me. Let me begin with a quotation from someone you may know well, Maria Keeley, who says that Ambrose's excellence lay in an intuitive understanding of the close bond between poetic image and the lives and hearts of his people. She continues, that's why he was such a great motivator, why he could bring Augustine to tears, why he could mobilize the city in 386. To me, this moving picture of a man who was dedicated to communicating the Word of God to his people is very accurate. It was a special gift at the time of the Basilica crisis that spanned a couple of years, 385 and 386. In fact, Ambrose used God's word in a very personal and unique way, guiding his people in the face of a serious and extended challenge from the imperial court. Now, there's a work of Ambrose. It's called The Appeal of Job and David, De Interpellatione, strange word, Job et David. To me, that has a very special connection to the crisis itself. Not only does Ambrose use the words and examples of Job and of David to talk about how to deal with unrest, the upset, the disturbance of that time, but it's a work that includes both observations from that time as well as reflections where he could look back. Because you know, Ambrose sometimes preached something but then took 2 or 3 years to publish it. I think this is one of those works where that exactly is what happened. It is, to say the least, a very original contribution of Ambrose, both to the field of biblical commentary, but also a contribution that has been almost completely ignored by scholars. Almost anything you read about this work, it's always about the structure, about the language, about things that are formal. But rarely does anybody try to dig into it and pull forth what Ambrose was really trying to do with it. So, no one has ever asked, why did Ambrose choose to put Job and David together using a singular, de interpellatione, the appeal of Job and David, as if they were one? Why did he choose to put these 2 men together? No one has ever answered or even asked that question. So it also seems to be that it gets aligned with the other piece of that. Why did he use the word appeal? Because appeal is one of those legal words, and Ambrose had a legal background, which means you're going to make an appeal to a court. Well, here it's an appeal made before God. Reading Job, reading David, so that his people will be heard. He also asks how to think about the justice of that time. So presenting the views of Job and David on the disturbing experiences of Valentinian's effort to use a basilica at Easter in 385 and again in 386 wasn't really about Valentinian. It's really about his mother. Valentinian was 15 years old. He was called emperor, but she was the one behind the throne. For Ambrose, there was only one reality, even if the way of reaching that one reality had different approaches. Structurally, the beginning of each of the sermons, so there are 4 sermons, Job, David, Job, David. The beginning of each of the sermons on Job, Ambrose follows a similar pattern. Here's the theme. Here's the experience of Job and David in a phrase or 2. And then he chooses significant passages in the first sermons, especially from Job, the second especially from David. Then he repeats the same thing for the other 2 sermons. It may not always be easy to see the logic of the many comments he makes in between, but it's worth noticing that Ambrose is more consistent than he is often given credit for. It takes a lot of work to find the thread that holds it all together. I think I've done some of that work, but I'm sure there's much more to be done. So I think it's important to read Ambrose, not just look for some kind of a logic or unity, or even to try to get involved in the polemics, the back and forth between him and the people who are supposed to be Arian. What matters is how he uses the words of Scripture to develop an understanding of the meaning and significance of the life of Christ for his church at that time. The ancient wisdom of Job and David adds much to the efforts of the surrounding culture to understand the human condition. Why do we have to suffer so much? And God's justice. Why do some people have and other people not? Perhaps that discussion can be helpful to us today. So with that little background, let me spend the rest of this presentation talking about the impact of the confrontation between Ambrose's community with the imperial leaders and forces of that time. Not just in general terms, but in the way he worked to overcome any sense of separation between the profession of faith and the lived experience of that faith. As I said at the beginning, one of the motives behind this comes from me from having read the Church in the Modern World exposition from the Second Vatican Council. So this work was published a couple of years after all of Milan had been through the experience of an emperor trying to take over a Catholic basilica so that the Arians, those who did not believe in the divinity of Christ, could use it for their gathering. Its origin appears to be tightly connected to the onset of the crisis in 385. It's not very obvious to me why a group of people who did not believe in the divinity of Christ would put out so much effort to use a basilica at Easter. That's not a question I'm going to be able to answer, but it does seem rather odd. But that's what happened, and Ambrose described the onset of their efforts as, quote, a heavy weight of troubles. He said that in a letter to his sister, Marcellina, who lived in Rome. It was clearly a time of great tension. Even Augustine, who was there in Milan preparing for baptism, talks about it, and his mother Monica was among those who were trapped in the basilica surrounded by troops. Many parts of that society were implicated, and here's what Augustine wrote to his sister. Very severe penalties were decreed at that time, first upon the whole body of merchants. Thus, during the sacred period of the last week of Lent, when the bonds of the debtors are usually loosened, chains were imposed on the neck of the innocent. 200 pounds of gold were demanded within 3 days. The merchants reply they will give as much, or twice as much again, so long as they may keep their faith. The prisons were filled with tradesmen. Persecution raged, and had an opening been found, they seemed ready to erupt into every kind of outrage, Ambrose wrote. Ambrose had to meet with some officials who urged him to give up the basilica. They said the emperor was absolutely within his rights to have it. Ambrose simply responded that he did not have the right to hand it over. Quote, if my patrimony is required, take it. If my person is required, here it is. Will you drag me away to prison or death? I will go with pleasure. I will not entrench myself by gathering a multitude around me. I will not lay hold of the altar and beg for my life. Rather, I will offer myself to death for the altar. I can't imagine how anybody would say that, but that's what he wrote to his sister. In that same letter, he spoke about what the community was doing, noting that the normal reading of the day happened to come from the book of Job. Ambrose made a simple admission to those gathered to hear him. Because of their patience in trial, he said, he felt like he was talking to people who were like Job. He wrote, "Then I began the following discourse. You have heard, my sons, the lesson from the book of Job, which according to the usual service of the season is now in course. Thanks be to our God, who has so confirmed you in faith and patience. I went up to the pulpit to admire Job. I found that I had all of you to admire as Jobs. Job lives again in each of you, in each patience and virtue of that saint. In each of you, the patience and virtue of that saint is reflected. For what more opportune could be said by Christians than that which the Holy Spirit has spoken to you today?" Ambrose found that he was strengthened by his people. Shortly thereafter, he said, "The whole of that day was spent in affliction. I could not return home because the church was surrounded by a guard of soldiers. We recited psalms with our brethren in the basilica of the church. Job during the day, David at night." In other words, Ambrose spent the beginning of the conflict with Valentinian with his people, talking about Job during the day, spending the night praying the Psalms of David. That's one of the facts that leads me to think that the work on Job and David is tightly connected to the crisis itself. It would have been the basis for asking David to let him bring their words together into an appeal before God for his people. The beginning of the Basilica crisis was already quite challenging for Ambrose and his community, but those events were also the source of new insights and real unity as their faith was tested by powerful people. He continues in the letter, "You see that the devil is given the power to test the good. The immoral one envies our progress in the good and tempts in various ways. He tempted holy Job in his heritage. He tempted him in his son, in his bodily pain. The stronger is tempted in his body. The weaker is tempted in that of another. He tried to take the riches that I, Ambrose, have in you. He wanted to plunder the heritage of your tranquility. He set out to snatch you from me, my good children, for whom I offer sacrifice every day. He was trying to entangle you in some of the ruins of this public disturbance." End quote. The thought that temptations are instigated by the devil is a reflection that I have not found in any other work of Ambrose prior to this one. It was thus the onset of the Basilica crisis that led Ambrose to make that point. a way of thinking about trial and turmoil that was stimulated by the crisis. He wrote, "The devil knew from experience that he should imitate this book, whereby the power of his temptation is evident. So he exerted himself in our midst with greater violence." Thus were the biblical roots of their present experience given a very interesting focus. It was not a matter of feeling unjustly treated. What was required of them, just as it was required of Job and David, was that their faith was being tested. And so they had to respond in faith. Then, as the day wore on, there was an unexpected change. Ambrose was told, as he was talking, that the imperial hangings, the banners of the emperor that had been hung on the portion basilica, because the emperor was claiming to have a right to enter there, those banners had just been taken down. Ambrose writes, while I was engaged with this subject, it was reported to me that the imperial hangings were taken down. The church was filled with people, and my presence was required. Straight away, I turned my discourse to this, saying, "How deep and profound are the oracles of the Holy Spirit. Remember, brethren, what was read this morning, how we responded with deep grief of mind." He recalled a phrase from the prayer of the morning from Psalm 79, which said, "O God, the heathen are come into your inheritance." He had seen that phrase as a source of much grief, as if the soldiers who had come into the church were there to impose Arian belief. But in fact, he now heard that the soldiers were not there, as they themselves confessed, to enforce the will of the emperor. Ambrose continues, "Those whom I accounted enemies have become my defenders. I have comrades, those whom I esteemed adversaries." It's interesting, the soldiers invaded the church, the people were really nervous. They said, no, we've come to pray with you. It's like, no wonder he was a bit aghast at hearing that. "You, Lord, planted yourself in the midst. You made the two one." Thus I wondered whether the emperor's mind could be softened by the zeal of the soldiers, by the entreaties of the counts, by the prayers of the people. "For whose work is this but yours, Lord Jesus? You saw armed men come into your temple. On the one hand, people groaning, collecting in a crowd that they might not seem to give up the basilica. On the other hand, the soldiers commanded to use force. Death was before my eyes. But you, Lord, planted yourself in the midst. You made the two one. You restrained the soldiers, saying, if you run to arms, if they who are within my temple are disturbed, what profit is it for my blood? All thanks, therefore, to you, O Christ, who is not an enemy, not a messenger, but you, O Lord, have delivered your people. A lot of other things could be said about this onset of the crisis. It will pick up again a year later. I won't bore you by trying to retell that whole story. This is more than enough to say how much emotion was involved. So, by showing that there is a connection between this rarely studied work and the imperial efforts to use Amelides Basilica for Arian worship, I think it will be possible to provide an interesting example of how Ambrose's spirituality and his public activity are neatly intertwined. So let's talk about the appeal of Job. In the time between the Basilica crisis and the publishing of this work, there was a gap, 3 or 4 years. In those intervening years, the discovery of the remains of the martyr Gervasius Protasius put an end to the second phase of the Basilica crisis. The Emperor Valentinian had to flee Milan because of the invasion from the north of Maximus. Maximus will lose his life in the efforts against him and against Theodosius, but little or nothing in the work on the appeal of Job and David even hints at the surrounding crisis, making it at least possible that a part of the appeal was preached in the midst of the crisis, even if the work as a whole was not published until a few years later. But there is a rather direct interest in addressing the unrest of his time. So when he talks about perturbatio, it's obviously not just this disturbance, but a wider sense of disturbance, often in very concrete, practical ways. Ambrose shows that he wants his people to appreciate how God is at work in everyday living, even if he may have seemed to be abiding his time or even absent. The experiences of Job and David are meant to inspire others to hear the biblical experience as a challenge to the cultural or philosophical thinking of that particular time. What is not important in that process is something we can begin to think about using that work. Job leads the community away from worldly wisdom by his implicit belief in the work of Christ, long before Christ came. He is the athlete who does not shy away from or complain about his misery, but faces it as a challenge. He refuses to agree with his critical friends who see the evils that have deprived him of everything as signs of God's punishment for his sins. Job is adamant, as Ambrose describes him, that his conscience is clear. The challenges he faces simply call him to believe more deeply and to accept it all as part of a larger plan. Rather than present Job as lamenting his bad fortune, Ambrose presents him as welcoming the occasion to show that he can handle the tests that God has set his way. As Hervé Savon has noted, the story of Job is not so much an unusual story as it is an example of the challenges that every person faces. So Job is a prophet of the future by carrying on the battle that will be completed by Christ. What is special about the way Ambrose presents the experience of Job is the way he sees his relationship with Christ, both in the past and in the present. In other words, he's not simply using an Old Testament story to call upon Job as a voice from the past. He tends to see the Word of God as much more than a bunch of words from another time. That becomes clear in his reading of Job as an athlete of Christ, before Christ, and as present in the people of the land, who, as already noted, were like a bunch of Jobs by their patient endurance. They were learning, as Job did, to act with courage in the face of threats, so that their experience of turmoil could help them, like Job, attain a crown of glory. In the same spirit, Ambrose sees Job as a part of the ongoing development through trial. Thus, Job became a prophetic witness to the resurrection of Christ. Ambrose writes, so, Job heeded what God had spoken to him. He knew through the Holy Spirit that the Son of God not only would come to earth, but was going to descend into hell to raise up the dead, as indeed was done at the time, as a testimony of present things and a model of future ones. So Ambrose continues, he turned to the Lord and said, would that you would keep me in hell, but hide me until your anger ceases and you set a time in which you will remember me. Quoting from the book of Job. I will survive until I exist again. Then you will call me and I will hear you. You will not despise the work of your hands. Now, you have numbered my actions, nor will any of my sins escape you. You have sealed my transgressions in a bag, and have noted if I have omitted anything unknowingly. Ambrose concludes, what a beautiful text that confirms us about the resurrection. Rather than give in to the criticism of those who claimed to be his friends, Job sees that resurrection is ahead of him. Affirming his own clear conscience, he preaches the authority of a conscience that calls upon God as a witness of its intention. Job could acknowledge weakness, the weakness of the human condition, and yet reject the lack of faith. Ambrose insists that no one is immune from fault. But forgiveness is the mercy of God. He again insists that no one is immune from fault. He again proposes Job as manifesting the right way to live in the midst of disturbing times, asking, let us, Ambrose says, imitate this man who disproved his accusers by his silence, for he showed strength of his spirit, which insults do not disturb. He manifested the innocence of his conscience, for he did not acknowledge the accusations, but laughed at them as foreign to him. Thus, Ambrose brings together Job's laughter and his good conscience. Parenthesis, the scriptural text that Ambrose had used the word laugh, but the original text, which Ambrose did not have, it wasn't laugh, it was cry out. But Ambrose loves the laughter and puts that right in the midst of the whole discussion. Thus does Ambrose bring together Job's laughter, his good conscience, and interior tranquility. He says, let the one who wishes to seek wisdom seek it there, where there is tranquility of heart and the peace that is beyond all understanding. Job lost everything, health, home, family, friends, but he did not lose his ability to laugh or his good conscience. This picture of Job was essential for Ambrose as he and his people struggled with the powerful who tried to neutralize their faith by imposing a different faith. Before concluding, a few words about David. Ambrose's appeal of David is primarily based on 3 Psalms, 41, 42, 72. Once again, he does not limit his comments to the original context or time of their composition. uses them to show the value of making an appeal to God. In his case, the overall emphasis is on the confidence that everyone should have in placing their own appeals before God. He wants to develop an understanding of the meaning and significance of the life of Christ for the church, knowing that the ancient wisdom of these biblical figures will help his listeners understand both the human condition and the justice of God. He's also telling us something about that which kept him going when he could not be sure whether he would be exiled or even executed. So, in Psalm 72, Ambrose uses David's confession that his envy of the well-off was an occasion for his having lost sight of God's plan. Ambrose writes, "For he saw that sinners were wealthy and rich in this world and enjoyed prosperity and abundance, whereas he, who had justified his heart, was in affliction and tribulation." End quote. Ambrose resets the question by emphasizing the benefits of facing adversity. He writes, "The one who has not struggled or been tried in the combat of various contests cannot hope for future rewards. But the one who is afflicted in this world, justly or unjustly, is happy either because he's paying the price of his sins or because he knows that there is a more abundant grace with the Lord, if unjustly he suffers misfortunes for Christ's name or for the sake of some good work." End quote. Thus did Ambrose see that David found strength in affliction. Where Job's plea had culminated in the fact that only Christ is the true source of wisdom, David's plea takes us to the altar. Ambrose writes, "Assenting to pious wishes, God anticipated desires by swift action and quickly brought the holy prophet into the church, into his tabernacles in spirit, and he set a holy altar, which would be the redemption of the whole world and the forgiveness of all sins, before his eyes. Accordingly, holy David is right to say, taking the role of one who is reconciled, 'I will go to the altar of my God, to God who gives joy to my youth.'" Where Job had dealt with the human condition and continued to lament even as he affirmed God's judgment, David leads the community to Christ, to the altar of God, with the melody of good works. Job heals the flesh. David reaches the soul. Conclusion. But you're happy to hear that word. The travails of the Basilica may have taken time to become a long reflection on the examples of Job and David, but the appeal of each of these biblical figures seeks to transform the way the people of Milan deal with life's troubles, without being distracted by those whose apparent peace and prosperity were in fact only distractions. He thus invites his people to appreciate divine wisdom as a challenge to the cultural, philosophical thinking of that time. His personal sense of devotion was at the root of his care for the life and the love of his community. Thus did Ambrose recognize that salvation was as close to him as his neighbor. The path to holiness was centered on the unity of that community, whether caught up in earthly disorders or dealing with a greedy emperor. As he will say in another place, we are the aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I have the microphone, so listen, it's time for you now. Questions, comments. Father Allan has graciously agreed to entertain some of your thoughts for a little while. Please, ask away. Or comment away. Or I might end up sitting next to you and putting the microphone in your hand. It's up to you to do it willingly or with a little bit of prodding.
And also to teach me by asking good questions.
Yeah. Is it because I'm holding a microphone? Is that what's scary?
I'll ask a starter for them, just to get them warmed up. How can we use this today in our world? And I'm going to ask you guys, how can we use this today in our university? Would you?
You know, if I were trying to be Ambrose today, I would say we spend so much time talking about the things that don't work, paying attention to our own inadequacies, and so little time noticing the goodness that we do or that's done to us. And to notice the goodness is to notice that one has a strength that one did not know they had. And so to appreciate the other side of this experience of what it means to face adversity, to find oneself on the outside, as Ambrose in his community did. It's really just a way of turning back to God and saying, okay, where are you?
Thank you. So I had a question. In today's world, I think people are getting more and more polarized and radicalized, and so with that, they're losing their friends, they're losing their families, and so they're feeling like Job, but they're not necessarily Job. And I guess how would Ambrose help define, the essence of Job versus Job-like symptoms? If that makes sense.
So I'll use a very non-Ambrosian kind of image. I think all of us know a little bit what it feels like to be driving and to be cut off by somebody who does something stupid. And how easy it is to come out with words that are perhaps helpful for us, but don't make any difference except to make us angrier. And I think the polarization is that kind of thing that if instead of reacting, we think in terms of kindness, we think in terms of, okay, God, what are you asking of me to make this situation better, if not to be patient with people we don't agree with, and some we want to respond really quickly to, but be patient and listen long enough to be able to say something that isn't just the opposite or disagreement, but is actually an invitation to say, are you sure? Or, gee, maybe we should talk about this too, so it doesn't become merely adversarial.
Test time. One more. You're feeling it. I'll ask one. I'll give you one more minute. I have a bunch, but I'll only ask one. What I really like using Job and David for that crisis, and as they have soldiers around the church, and if I'm thinking of my audience, not so much as those who are well educated in the Old Testament, but rather as Romans who are educated on Cincinnatus and Romulus and Caesar, they get David. Like, all right, that's a king, he's a soldier, he's a warrior, I get that guy. But Job, I don't have any background for that. I wondered if you'd say kind of the changing ideal of our heroes now in the 4th century. They're not going out to meet the soldiers with weapons, in other words.
When you start to think of how even someone like me, or who's done all sorts of reading of the Bible. I remember when I graduated from high school, I decided I would read the Bible from cover to cover. And I actually did. And I said it was the last time. Because some parts of the Bible are very inspiring, and some parts of the Bible are just, okay, fine. I don't need to read that. But I think what Ambrose was trying to do was to help people say the appearance isn't always the reality. And by spending obviously more than a little time with Job and also with David, Ambrose has a way of trying to say, no, these are not just words from the past. These are words from the depths of one another. Words of the body of Christ. Words that in some ways are already within them if we will simply allow them to come to the surface and change the way we speak, think, and act. Patrick has a question.
I am struck by the way that Ambrose uses, just as you just said, the stories to invite people into be Christ or be Job. I'm wondering if Ambrose uses stories to invite those he disagrees with to sort of experience conversion. So did he leverage Job or David to invite the emperor to change his mind?
I think we know less about exactly how that happened, but he's free to transmit brief conversations with people who are clearly adversarial. But we don't really know, how did he succeed in this embassy to Maximus? How did he succeed in talking to Valentinian, his mom? And yet he appears to have been able to do that. And it has to be because he didn't take every conversation to the moment of ultimate confrontation. So I know when somebody asks me or confronts me with something that I know is just going to lead to banging heads, I will say something like, that would be a really interesting discussion. I think we should do it at a time when we have some time. Which on my part is a way of saying, I really disagree with you, but I really want to hear more about this in a time when we can talk. My guess is that that's a little bit of Ambrose. He knew how to avoid headbanging because he could see whether or not the person was going to be open to any discussion. But there's one of the counts or the people around Valentinian who really goes after him, and Ambrose has some very sharp words to him, so he does both. But we don't have a lot of insight into exactly how that happened, only that it did.
Thank you, and since I still have the microphone, can I? So you said that Ambrose chose these stories because of their potency. What are the stories of Ambrose's life that have potency for us as Ambrosians today? How can we be Ambrose?
I think it's wonderful to read something that Augustine wrote in his Confessions about Ambrose, about his time in Milan, and how he came upon Ambrose reading silently, and he didn't want to interrupt. Apparently what's going on there is he knew Ambrose had so many things going on all around him that to find a man who had found some quiet and wasn't even reading out loud the way most people did, because he knew that if he started to read out loud, he was going to get questions. And he therefore gave us a sense of who this man, how this man needed his own time of peace, his own time of quiet to prepare for all the other times. And that seems to me to be a picture of Ambrose that doesn't come directly from Ambrose himself, but that is just beautifully representative of what this man had to deal with. In spite of being an aristocrat, from a wealthy family, from a governor's position, he had somehow become, with people, a person who felt, who knew what compassion was, and people knew that he knew that. And so when all of these things happened, they flocked to the churches. They were going to support him in whatever way they could, because he felt so much for them. That's a nice challenge, I think, for all of us. God knows it's a challenge, but it's beautiful.
All right. Any of you athletes want to ask if you should have compassion for the other team? Just throw that. Do you have a question?
No, I'll ask it though. Compassion for other teams.
So, if I'm in a game and I want to make sure that I win, I will have so much compassion that I will hope that they will be able to deal with the fact that they will lose.
Perfect. Thank you, Father Allan, for coming tonight. Everyone, please. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. There are drinks and snacks at the back. More questions to be asked. Enjoy each other's company before heading on home. Thank you, everyone.
Please eat the food, otherwise it gets thrown out.